as a society, we don't have an understanding of money. We don't have an understanding of good economics, in my opinion. We take for granted all of the things about the world that we do understand. And Bitcoin itself is a new form of money. This technology has these emergent properties of a new paradigm of things. So there's like multiple reasons why Bitcoin is a little bit harder to understand. Money itself is the organizer of human action. Through the price system, we all bid with our time. That price has a huge influence on that. It's not the only factor that you consider, but it's one of the biggest factors that you always consider on which actions you're going to take. And when you increase the money supply or you change the money supply, inflation itself is distorting that price system.
Ben Prentice is the co-creator of WTF Happened in 1971.com and the producer of What Bitcoin Did. WTF Happened in 1971 is a meme site which highlights a variety of financial charts and data that all appear to break after the year 1971. The meme has gone viral and been shared by millions of people worldwide, including the Twitter co-founder Jack Dorsey, who earlier this year created a hashtag WTF Happened in 1971 on the 50th anniversary of the United States going off the gold standard. In today's episode, Ben shares his background, his Bitcoin origin story, the origin story behind his popular meme site, and how he became the producer of What Bitcoin Did, and much, much more. So with that said, let's dive in with the one and only Ben Prentice. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you like and comment below. And to find future episodes in your feed and push notifications, make sure you subscribe. And if you click the little bell, you'll get every new episode as it's released. Thanks again for watching. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up, Jay?
What's going on? So like I tell you, everybody that comes on the show, the first question I ask are, who are the top 5 people that you surround yourself with the most these days professionally? Take out your family. I'm trying to understand who's influencing the way Ben Prentice is thinking.
Besides Jay Gould, obviously. That's a good question. I try not to play favorites too much, but man, I love listening to American Huddle. He's hilarious, but he has this like kind of street smarts it's a different type of smarts than I do, and he looks at the world a little bit different. So I really like listening to him. As you know, I spend a lot of time on Clubhouse, so that's one of the places. I also met Pete Rizzo there. Really like the way that guy thinks. If you haven't listened to him on podcasts or done his writings. Really enjoy Nick Carter. You said top 5, right? Have you ever do you ever follow Shinobi? He's kind of an interesting guy. He kind of is
no.
He's into like more of the mechanics of Bitcoin, and kind of economic stuff like that. And of course I can't go without mentioning Heavily Armed Clown, who's my partner in crime. You know, I've done a lot of podcasts with. So he's actually, I think, one of the more brilliant guys in my circle.
So I can't go without noticing that you didn't mention Peter.
So yeah, Peter. I mean,
Is he not influencing you?
I don't talk to Peter as often as a lot of people think I
really?
do. I do what I can do so that he can do the things that he does, which is networking, which is research on stuff. We're handling the podcast, and I actually I do talk to him sometimes, but it's sometimes it's rare. I mean, sometimes I'll go almost a whole month or two without like having more than a 3-minute conversation on the phone with him. And we don't go back and forth much. It's just like it's what do you call that? Specialization. We're all doing our own separate things, and it makes a whole. But we honestly don't have to talk that often.
How do you, just curious, as a producer for the show, I would imagine there's a combination of this, but he's out there probably getting, because of his notoriety, he's probably getting a lot of them and just sending them your way for scheduling. But I'm imagining you're also trying to help book some folks as well, or is there coordination in that sense though, I guess?
Definitely. There's been a few like pet project shows that I really wanted to make that I've kind of helped push through. But
Rob Hamilton,
I was part of that. But Peter actually, kind of found his article and stuff. But I helped. I was like, no, we definitely got to make this. Rob's awesome, And then I drove down to New York to kind of record it with them and hang out.
I wish I could have came up to see you guys. You were there for like.
I called you. Yeah, we almost tried to get together. You had some kid stuff going on. Totally understand. But like, listen, his email. He says on almost every show, like, email me, hello, what Bitcoin did, and like. You just get so many suggestions that some of it was just filtering that. It was a fire hose of like
Sure.
all these different people. So we would just kind of all as a team kind of figure out which shows to make. And sometimes it's hard. I mean, it's so many shows that we can make, you know?
So Ben, why don't we take a step back? I met you on Clubhouse, like you said, right? So we met there and really got to know you over the course of almost a year now. It's probably been a year, and became fascinated with your story. So why don't you tell everybody what your background is and where you grew up, what your education was, and then we'll get into from there a couple things about Bitcoin. But I just want to learn about you first and where you're from.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I grew up in a relatively small town in Massachusetts, lived around Northeast for my whole life. And I actually, I went to public school for up until high school, but then I went to kind of a more alternative school, like a hippie school almost, where it's very like libertarian in a way, where it's like you actually don't technically have to attend any classes if you don't want to.
Nice.
You could leave the campus. This is a K through 12 school. You could leave the campus. You could swear. You could start your own businesses. All of the rules of the school and all of the judiciary, like disciplinary action, where was like a judicial committee run by the students. All the rules of the school and like how the funding went and even what the teachers got paid got decided by a town hall of the students. So it was a very, very different model than most kids are used to. And like the way that you graduate from the school is by like writing a thesis, and the thesis that you're writing is that I'm ready to become a member of society, and you defend it like you would like a PhD doctoral thesis. So very fascinating, just very different from what most people are kind of used to when they think of education. And it's kind of built on the premise that like, when kids play, they're learning, right? They play in order to learn, and it's like when you watch a cat play, they fight with each other, but they're like learning how to fight, right? It's kind of that idea.
Yeah, they don't break skin. Yeah,
exactly. Yep. It's that idea that kids will kind of. It's surprising that I've seen kids go to their entire lives. They're never forced to do anything, and they learn to read and they learn to do all these other things, and they become excellent members of the society and a community. So that's interesting thing about me. I was also in a rock band for 13 years. Not a lot of the people we know that. So that was a lot of fun, and also kind of led to some of my hobbies with media. I learned how to do video editing and audio editing and mixing and mastering and special effects, Photoshop, video, all this fun stuff, just kind of on my own in my own free time. And later on, that ended up helping me kind of switch jobs, as we'll probably talk about later. But I don't know. I just I actually worked in restaurants for a really long time, and until I found Bitcoin, and then I had to make a career choice. So.
What did your parents do? What kind of socioeconomic conditions did you grow up in?
My parents were like kind of middle class, and my dad, my mother was a sign language interpreter, among like other things. Yeah. So like language was kind of always, I speak a few different languages. That was kind of always like a thing in our house, where my mom spoke German and my dad spoke Spanish. And my father, though, he was a software engineer. And it's funny because sometimes I go back, I'm like, Dad, why didn't you like push me to be a software engineer? I'd probably be like a lot wealthier today. And he's like, well, I didn't want to push you to do anything, son. But he was like not just a software engineer. He was an engineer, like as a person. And that was something that I definitely learned from him. The way that he would tackle a problem, the way that he would kind of look at it and use logic, and when he would never give us the answers to things, like he would always help us get there. And he was also the type of person that's like, a lot of parents, like when the kid asks why, right? The parents, like, they're like, okay, well, it's because, the sky's blue because of and after 3, they're like, okay, go read a book or something. And he would just keep going. He did not care how many times you said why or what or how, like we would find the answer to it. And that was something, that stayed with me to this day, that passion and curiosity for life.
Did you go to college? What school did you go to?
I went to Framingham State University. I actually originally wanted to be a teacher, which is funny, docents, right? And I realized I couldn't teach in the public school system, and ended up getting a degree in geography, believe it or not, with like environmental studies. I wanted to work with computers and mapping and data, like geographical information systems. And then right when I graduated, it was like basically 2008. So all of those jobs were government jobs, and there was like a hiring freeze for like 3 years. And then I ended up just kind of staying in the restaurant industry because that's what I was doing at the time during college. So it's kind of a twist of fate,
Okay, so were you an athlete as a kid too at that school? Did they have sports at that school? Did you play sports?
I played sports growing up. They didn't really have sports there, but I was always like very active. Very, I played played soccer in when I was in public school. I played years of soccer. I never did it like, really. It was sports was never like I love sports, but I love playing them. I never like got into like watching sports. So I'm not one of those people. So if you ask me, what was on the game, I was like,
you don't know all the stats of all the players.
Yeah, I'm the type of person that's like, if you want to go play a game, I'll play a pickup game of any game anytime.
Cool. Let's dive into. I want to really skip ahead here. So let's look at your Bitcoin origin story. How did you discover Bitcoin? What year did you first hear about it? What year did you start really getting curious about it too? So originally hearing, and then how did you get curious?
It's devastating because it was like 2011 or 2012.
When you first heard.
Oh yeah. Like, you ever heard of Slashdot? It was this, So like News for Nerds, it was like where like the smart people on the internet hung out in the 90s. Because most people weren't on the internet in the 90s, and these were all like the geeks and the coders. And it's funny because I read like their comments about Bitcoin, and like our understanding like as a society of Bitcoin is better today than it was back then. But still, these guys were still like, there's definitely something here, and I was like, that's pretty cool, but it'll probably never work. And then 2014-ish, when people were buying drugs on the internet on Silk Road, it kind of came back up, and I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll buy some drugs on the internet. And I tried to I tried to go to Mt. Gox, and I went to the website, and I went to go buy some. And I thought at the time, we all thought that Bitcoin was just like this anonymous e-money, right? Yes. It was just like basically what people think of Monero today. And I went to go buy, and they were like, okay, so give us your bank account details, send us your license and all these. I was like, this isn't anonymous. What the hell is this? So I closed the window and basically forgot about it until 2017. And I kid you not, like we joke about like number go up, like bringing people into Bitcoin. But like, I kid you not, the price going up and people talking about it on the news was like, made me take a step back, not be like, have FOMO, but like, I need to understand more about what Bitcoin is. I remember saying that to myself, and it was like January 2018, like right after the crash. And I was like, what happened? Why does the price go up and down? Because, like money, you think money is like stable. Why does the price even go up and down? I know it seems like such a stupid question to ask today, but I just in trying to answer that, it took me like a week or two of research, maybe 3 weeks before I found Andreas Antonopoulos. And I basically watched like 200 out of his 400 videos. Read his book, and that catapulted me into the rabbit hole, and then it goes on from there. So I don't know where you want to go next.
So 2011, 12, you hear about it. 2014, you're like, maybe I want to mess around with this, but you didn't think of it as a long-term investment anyway. And then by 2018, you started to research it more because you kept hearing about it more often. And at that point, you're like, wait a second, this is not what I thought it was.
Right, exactly. Then, I started arguing with people on the internet, as we do, and started to realize that I didn't know as much about economics as I thought I did. And I found some podcasts that were about Bitcoin. And there was this guy named Pierre Rochard, and he talked about all these interesting economics, like Australian economics or something. I hadn't heard of it before. And I'm joking because it's Austrian economics. And I really fell down that rabbit hole. I listened to the things that I should read by him, started going down that rabbit hole. And then I actually joined a book club with a few of my buddies. Justin Moon started, and Max Hillebrand and a few other guys. And that was when I really
It was a Bitcoin book club?
Bitcoin Austrian Economics Book Club. So it was like... That's
interesting.
Yeah, because it was, Austrian Economics...
And that was 2018, Ben? That was about 2018?
This is, end of 2018. So so this is after I'd been basically only listening to a few podcasts and watching Andreas Antonopoulos for a while. I got into altcoins a little bit and I got out of them when I got into the Austrian economics. And that was also how I met, I kind of going to the podcast. That's how I met my friend, Heavily Armed Clown, at the end of his podcast. He's one of those guys like, hey, if you ever want to reach out, have a chat. And he was really big into Austrian economics too.
So I met most of these characters like Andreas and all these guys on Clubhouse. I've never heard of them before that. And what's amazing for me, at least it feels amazing, is that like I was in a circle with all the Valley guys. You've all heard of a lot of the names, right? And nobody was talking about any of these people at all. I mean, as you obviously know, they're mostly focused on Ethereum type of stuff, but I wasn't, and I just thought this was an insider game. VCs were playing. They're not really buying the coin. They're just buying the rails, and they're going to make money on these, the ecosystem essentially, And so I just was like, you know what? I'm not at that level that they're at in terms of having access. So it just wasn't interesting to me. And I was focused on my own startup. But what I'm getting to is that I meet all these people like American Hodl, probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. Actually, he's a super smart guy. Way understated because he like dumbs it down and like curses and acts like an idiot and but he's super fucking smart, right? So got a lot of respect for Hodl. But then you meet like Preston Pish and when I met Preston Pish, it was on Clubhouse. He would jump into the digital gold rooms in the mornings, right? He would come in for like an hour or so, just very nonchalantly. And someone's like, "You should bring up Preston." I'm like, "Who's Preston?" So I bring up Preston. Right? and then we're just having conversations about like macroeconomics and bonds and interest rates, 10-year yields, all this kind of stuff, right? And Mike Hobart, right? So Mike's on there. And I forget, it was like the third day in a row, like Preston was coming in. And he's like, "Dude, it's so cool. We're talking to Preston." I'm like, "Why is that cool?" And he's like, "Dude, do you don't know who Preston, the Investors Podcast?" I'm like, "No, I don't know." And then he showed it to me. I was like, "Holy shit, this guy's got a huge following. This is incredible." There's so many people like this in Bitcoin. And thank God for people like this in Bitcoin, because they've reached people like you and others, and they continually reach it. Because when you really think about it, and we'll get to your website in a second too, those types of things are so important because we take for granted once you've actually come up the curve a little bit, and you never know everything about Bitcoin, as you know, right? But when you finally get there, you're less, I guess it's like less interesting to kind of tell people and teach people or something, and you kind of like move on because you have your own selfish freeds. But like guys like Preston, he's constantly, Lynn Alden, right? They're constantly teaching, they're constantly evangelizing, they're thought leaders, right? And I think it's really important because there's always new participants coming into Bitcoin that have an insatiable appetite to go down a rabbit hole, and they're looking for those types of people. So let's get to your website because it kind of brings me to that. Mm-hmm. Heavily armed clown and you decide to build this website, but it wasn't like you decided to build it. You must have come across something first that sparked your interest, that you saw and you said, "Wait, there's something here." Bring us through the origin of how that came about. By the way, that's WTF happened in 1971.com for those who don't know what we're talking about, but you get it.
Right. And so Heavily Armed Clown and I kind of became friends after I reached out to him and went on his podcast, and we started talking a lot about economics, Bitcoin, obviously. And I was like newly armed with my Austrian economics knowledge. I went back out and started arguing with people on the internet again, because now I kind of had a better idea. And, I do this to kind of test my own ideas, but also for, just the kind of public discourse of like, why Bitcoin matters. And you start to learn about the modern monetary system, how it actually functions. And that's, like one of the books I read was about central banking and all these things. And if you're trying to learn about that at all, you realize that we went off the gold standard in 1971. Richard Nixon, he ended the convertibility of the dollars into gold, August 15th. And that event, if you go like look around on Wikipedia, you'll find a few pages like the Bretton Woods, you'll find the Nixon shock, and you'll actually see some of the charts from our website on those pages. And we started like finding data that kind of supported our position that like going off the gold standard, like here's the data, look, it's actually a few of these things kind of changed, and like that's kind of interesting. And we started like collecting more of these charts, and we'd continue arguing with people on the internet and be like, no, like look, you can see here's the data, like you can't really argue with this. And we ended up getting a lot of them. And like it was Pierre Richard actually was having a conversation with this guy Malik, and I think Malik was the one that just said, "Oh man, WTF happened in 1971," and like we had seen that previously. And Colin had the idea, Heavily Armed Clown, to just throw it on a website, because we were like constantly going through our phones trying to find all these charts and post them and rebuttal to all these arguments. And he just thought it would be kind of funny if we just like put up a big question at the top. And I was like, yeah, it's a great idea. And we just kind of threw them all up there. I'd kind of collected all the charts, but I kind of give him props for the idea of the website itself. And we never really thought it would be a big thing. We weren't trying to like
What was it at first? Like, when did it start to take off? Because I imagine, like anything, it takes a little bit of time to have some momentum and traction, right?
Yeah, so I think that was November of 19, or yeah, because I think that was too early to have been 18. I think it was November of 19, and it wasn't the big thing at first, but we just kept sharing it. When something would come up, we would share it. Eventually, we made the Twitter account for it, but we started doing podcasts, and that was kind of how it would build, right? It's like one small podcast would hear about us, and then it would kind of get shared a little bit, and then it would and it was like very organic, and surprisingly, like you find our website in all these weird places. Like, we didn't do a lot of promoting for the website other than just like tweeting out a few times, and we have relatively small Twitter accounts. A lot of what made the site big was other people sharing it. When Bitcoiners found it and realized, well, because it's very easy to go to the site and see there's an inflection point in the data that changed. Something changed. Even if you're not saying it's good or bad.
Everything starts bifurcating and changing. It's like crazy. These charts are all in line, and then they just break apart,
Yes. And that really hits people, and they say, what did happen in 1971? And what's really powerful about the meme itself is that instead of trying to spoon feed you the answer, it forces you to actually ask that question and go try to answer it for yourself, which is what we had to do too. We kind of saw those charts originally. We're like, man, why did this? Why did the trade balance change? Why did productivity separate from wages? And that's an interesting, kind of self-Socratic discovery journey that you have to go through when you see this.
So there's like 60 plus charts, right, on the site?
Yeah, it started with I want to say 20. And, as we would share it and as we created the Twitter account, we started getting it basically became a crowdsourced thing. Yeah. And we would filter and find the ones with the inflection points and get them up there. And now it's over 60 the last I checked. So
what is the one chart that you see and makes you say, this is the most important data point that of all the things? Like, what is the one thing that stands out the most to you?
Man, people always ask me that, and I feel like I always try to give them a different answer.
So there's really not one.
No, but one of the really interesting ones that's kind of hard to understand on the website is the one that shows basically the political right and left, the Republicans and Democrats, and how under a gold standard we kind of were finding more common ground. You can see these two charts coming together, and then in 1971 it breaks apart again. And there's another one that's right near that's like political speeches used stupider language post 1971. Like, they were getting smarter, and politics was getting smarter. And then the speeches that they used, under analysis of all the words that were in the speeches, got dumber and dumber after 1970. I don't know, some kind of interesting ones there. But there's so many good ones, and trying to figure out why we put all those up there is actually, I think, half the fun, to be honest.
I think the one, and I'll have it in front of me because it was the productivity, right, versus the wages. To me, that's the one chart that I'm like, wow, because that's what you hear about in the media. This is what you hear about all the time, which is the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And then the narrative is that it's the rich's fault, but it's really not, right? Whose fault is it, Ben?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Jay. I mean, I attribute a lot of this to monetary policy because, as I say, wealthy folks, they have the opportunity to be able to hold some of their wealth in financial assets. And the poorest folks don't have that opportunity. They have to hold liquid cash. They live paycheck to paycheck. They need to be able to spend that money. They can't afford a financial advisor. They can't, it's just disproportionately out of their reach to hold assets. Most of them don't even own homes. Even if you're in kind of a middle class, even if you don't have stocks or something, you still have a house. Those are financial assets. When we increase the money supply, which is the Federal Reserve, they have, dovish policy, a lot of different tools in their tool shed to kind of influence the money supply. And this is, it's what they do. They're not hiding this. They look for inflation. They're trying to target basically the devaluation of the currency. It's just another way of saying what they're saying. And that policy makes it harder for savers, harder for fixed income people, and harder for people without assets. And it kind of, in my opinion, stratifies wealth in that sense. It's like, if you don't have assets, you're swimming upstream. And if you do have assets, you're kind of riding that wave, that wave of inflation. Inflation kind of helps you in a way. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, let's go back to like your origin of Bitcoin relative to this too. Like, so is there, if for people that are trying to get Bitcoin, right? And I say this all the time to people, it's like, can you give me an elevator pitch that makes someone understand, or orange pill somebody in a sentence or two? I don't think it's possible, right? I mean, it took you a while, it took me a while. I think everybody I know, they weren't able to get it right away. It's unfortunate, right? Because there's an old saying, you'll buy Bitcoin at the price you deserve, but I don't know that they deserve that. Like, it's such a crude thing to say. It's just a shame that we can't make it simpler for people to click. I think inflation, WTF happened in 1971 as well, showing you that there's like this coming off the gold standard. It's a little simpler for people to get. I know it's not that simple, right? But I think it is. I think your website is very helpful for people in that sense, because you can see there's a real problem here. Like, something happened here, and is it because we came off the gold standard and that we have monopoly money now, right? And as a result, you're getting further and further left behind.
Well, there's some technical aspects to Bitcoin that takes some time to learn, but really what you're getting at there, I think, is just as a society, we don't have an understanding of money. Mm-hmm. We don't have an understanding of like good economics, in my opinion. You have Keynesians going around saying we can print as much money as we need. Modern monetary theory, inflation doesn't matter. Neither does debt. Don't worry about any of those things. That's our understanding. Those things make no sense once you really understand money. And we take for granted all of the things about the world that we do understand. That really took many years of us learning and understanding these things. We're just starting to understand money. And that takes some time to kind of get, and Bitcoin itself is a new form of money. This technology has these emergent properties of a new paradigm of things. So there's like multiple reasons why Bitcoin is a little bit harder to understand. But it's you don't really have to spend hundreds and hundreds of hours understanding Bitcoin. You do need to find the right amount of sources of information, I think. And, you can, it also depends on where you're from. I think the folks that really need Bitcoin are the ones that understand it more, people in third world countries and all these other things. And that journey, like it's different for, you don't have to explain to somebody in Venezuela why Bitcoin is important. You just have to tell them you can't print more of it. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. Where do I get some? Right. So it really depends. Like, in developed countries, like, we don't really need Bitcoin as much, so there's not as much of a push towards it.
Yeah, and I feel like people that have a lot of money, my wealthy friends, they feel like they don't need to understand it. Like, they have assets that are keeping up or beating inflation, so
and they'll be okay. They don't need it today, right?
Yeah, like I have a lot of friends that have had exits and sold companies, and they have a bunch of stocks, S&P type of stuff, private equity, real estate, and they're like, I'm doing perfectly fine. It's like, okay.
But that's not to say that they can't benefit from it, Jay. If they do take some time to understand why it's important, if what we say about Bitcoin is correct, that basically it's undergoing this monetization phase, that if you're an early adopter of Bitcoin during this phase, you can gain from that adoption by being early, by helping hold Bitcoin, by bootstrapping its liquidity as a money, because all these people need it in third world countries, and because our money is broken for reasons like my website, that in the future, and by the way, it just takes time for this to happen. But like, if you do take the time to understand it, they can still benefit. They just don't necessarily need it, especially not in the short term.
So you're going down this rabbit hole. You meet Heavily Armed Clown. You guys build this website. You're out there learning. And then you run across Peter's website, right? How did you become the producer for What Bitcoin Did? How did that all come about?
Well, actually, I'd been listening to Peter's podcast for quite some time. It was it was basically Tales from the Crypt, Marty Bent, Pierre Richard had a podcast, Stefan Livera, What Bitcoin Did. Those are my main podcasts. So I've been listening to What Bitcoin Did since like close to the beginning, off and on different times. And then, so I like to joke that, so I am the producer of What Bitcoin Did now, and I like to joke that I kind of memed myself into this job because I got on Peter's show because of the website. WTF happened in 1971, because of the meme we created, that it got us onto the show twice, actually. So he knew who I was only because of the website. The website was was a predecessor to him knowing who I was. And so I messaged him back someday, and I was like, listen, dude, I want to get out of what I'm doing. I want to get into Bitcoin. And I know pretty much everything there is to know about like the basics of media production. I can learn anything you want. I'll do anything you need. And he was like, no, don't worry, mate. I have like a team of people that does this stuff for me. And like a month later, he came back to me. He's like, what do you do again? How much money do you make? He's like, do you want to be a producer? And I was like, what are you talking about? I was like, I was just going to like maybe do a little bit of work for him here and there and try to like ease my way. And so he's like, no, just quit your job. And so now I work for Peter full time, and now I'm a video editor and a producer and booking and doing research.
And about that team, did he really have a team, or was it really just him doing it himself for the most part?
Yeah, he had 2 or 3 people, depending on how you look at it.
Independent contractors, yeah.
Yeah, and then he kind of he made it a little bit bigger, and he kind of made it back. So now we're more like Joe Rogan's. It's like we have a core team of like three people. Yeah, and
I mean, you don't need a lot of people. Yeah, there's not a lot. No. And so what do you do? You do some of the editing for the page and stuff, or sorry, for the site rather, and then the videos, the interviews, the audio. You do scheduling. What exactly do you guys do?
Yeah, so there's a surprising amount of work that goes into it. As you're probably learned by doing a podcast. Just like we put so much information from each show, all this research about the things that are mentioned in it, how it relates to our previous shows, information about the person. We put timestamps on everything, but designing like the content that we do, like figuring out, like we said earlier, which guests we should do, how do we approach these topics, who do we put together, where do we do it? Now we're trying. Peter used to do every single interview in person, and after basically he stopped being able to fly, right, because of COVID, and so he was doing everything remote. Now that he can fly again, he is back to trying to do like almost every single one in person. So now it's like a lot more to like book a place to do it. Has to be like a good setting with a table. We got to get our our gear there. We got to get cameramen there. Then we got to get videos uploaded all across. One of my team is in Australia. He flies around sometimes. So it's like there is a lot of logistics in that sense. There's a lot of copy writing that we have to do. But I'm actually doing all the editing of the video and the audio now. That's a newer thing for me that I'm kind of learning as I go too. So I love it.
Yeah, I outsourced that as well, actually. Yeah, in the beginning, I did the first like 5 or so episodes myself, and then I was using a couple people from Upwork, and they weren't working out, and then I found somebody else that was recommended, and he's doing a pretty good job, so I stick with him now. Tell me the most productive habit that you have. Most
productive habit? That's a good question. In life, I've always had hobbies that kind of, and sometimes it takes a long time for them to pay off, but sometimes having weird hobbies can be really productive because, like I said, all of my interests in media really helped me get this job. So that's kind of one side of it. The other thing is just constantly learning. I knew about Bitcoin enough so that in 2017 when I saw it on the news, I was like, oh, this thing is still around, right? Like I knew how long it had been around. I knew people were buying drugs on the internet with it a few years ago. I knew now that I needed to figure out why it's still around and all these things. So ever since the dawn of the internet, even as like a 10-year-old kid, my dad get their first, modem was squawking and making all those beeps and stuff. I was just enthralled by the fact that there's just this amazing town square of information that the whole world was sharing. And that's only, as grown exponentially. I cannot turn this thing off. That's, people are always on their phones for different reasons. For me, it's the information. I'm plugged into that. So I am addicted to information itself. And sometimes that, sometimes you're just like on Twitter scrolling, you're not productive. But like when I try to find when that's the case and you're not productive, find some other source of information and just keep absorbing and taking information and thinking critically about it and banging ideas off people and searching for that truth. That's the most productive thing I think I do.
Would you say the most unproductive thing you've been doing is Clubhouse?
Sometimes no. So, listening to HODL, American HODL,
there's no question.
Sometimes or meeting Eric Weinstein or Preston Pish.
I mean, all these guys. There's no question. There's been a lot of positive at it, but I do feel like there's a little bit of a diminishing return, right?
Sometimes, yes, for sure. I've been trying to moderate that.
Yeah, it's interesting. What? Tell me about Clubhouse though, because it's certainly how I met a lot of these guys, and it introduced me to a whole new world, a whole new understanding of Bitcoin by meeting these guys. But to you, you already had that understanding because you had met them a couple years before and stuff. What did it do for you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, it became an outlet to kind of. I always, again, your show is docents. I've always liked helping people understand things. I don't like the idea of like a teacher who's just this person who yells things from a classroom. I like it that learning is a collaborative effort of discovery, where it's a back and forth thing. And when I found Clubhouse, that it was like one of the coolest mediums because I could just be walking around my house doing some chores.
So cool.
and I could be teaching somebody, and going back and forth with them and answering questions and asking them questions. And that was like kind of magical for me. And I've met people that I've like tried to orange pill in real life. And they're like, man, you're so good at doing this. Like you should spend more time doing this. I was like, you don't understand. He's like, I spend all my time.
8 hours a day doing it.
Yeah, exactly. So that was really cool. I also got to like really meet some Bitcoiners and like, you meet somebody on Twitter. It's not the same thing. I feel like I've known you for years now, Jay.
Dude, the amount of hours we spent. Yeah, exactly.
In Clubhouse rooms. And like, it's, so there's a social aspect for me that's like, again, I work from home now. So I just hanging around the house, doing some chores, eating lunch. I get to kind of hang out with my friends, also keep up with the information, the news of what's happening, and meet people and network and all those things. It's hard to describe all those things wrapped into one, and then also sometimes just waste time and have a good time.
Exactly. Clubhouse it's interesting because there's a educational aspect to it, but there's also kind of like a let loose and just chill aspect to it, which I thought was it's kind of an evolving thing that happened over the last year. It wasn't like that when we first jumped in. You go into other rooms outside of Bitcoin too. It's an entirely different experience where they're like, they act weird. This is Jay, I'm signing off, or, I'm done speaking. I'm like, what are you doing? We're just hanging out like we were hanging out in a bar. Like everybody's just having a conversation, which I thought was much more relaxed. And at least for me, it was an easier way to learn. One thing that I had the benefit of is that when I went in there, I don't know quite why, but I wasn't shouted down for stupid questions. Like, I think Hodl heard my background and was like, oh, well, this guy's real. Like, he's done real stuff. So he wasn't dismissive. But I've heard, not Hodl, but I've heard, because he's actually really good at not doing that. Some of the other folks, not to name names, the maximalists that are kind of toxic will yell at people and throw them off the stage. And you're like, what the fuck is going on? Like, because this is a whole new thing. I wasn't a part of Bitcoin Twitter. I'm like, what is happening? Why are these people yelling at each other? So that was an interesting dynamic that I haven't seen. And that's a dynamic within the community of Bitcoin, it seems, right? So what do you think of that?
It's definitely, but I think there's a really important point in here somewhere, Jay, and there's like one of the points, a slightly different one, is that something that kind of American Hodl really articulated well for me, which is that there is always kind of people on both sides of this bell curve, and there is a reason that the people are kind of toxic sometimes, and some people just kind of like they're just like, oh, being toxic is great, and they're stupid, but I think when you came to Bitcoin, you had some hard questions for us, and you didn't do it in an arrogant way. You did it in a persistent way, and that's a huge difference. Is somebody comes
genuinely
on, they're
curious,
like, yes, you were genuinely curious, and you would push back, and you would push back like pretty like passionately, and there's almost this hairline between doing what you're doing and doing what somebody's doing when they're like, well, that just can't work,
Right. They had an agenda, the other folks. Yeah.
And I think people will do that latter thing where they're like, well, Bitcoin can't work because of this. And it's like I said, they're so close. There's a really thin line between those things.
Yeah. I think the difference is I have a bag and I've been sitting on it for a while, and I'm like, not fully convicted, even though I had it.
Right.
The conviction I actually built on Clubhouse with Hodl and Preston and you and others, and it gave me a strong, and it made me go down a different rabbit hole, start to read things that I didn't know about, go into blogs that I wasn't aware of, podcasts. I'm like, holy shit, and I've really started to learn, to your point earlier, you have to learn about money to really understand Bitcoin. That's the key.
Yes.
You got to learn about money. And I think what it is that most of my friends that are in the Valley that are kind of messing around with the shitcoins and stuff, and they also own Bitcoin, right? They view it all as a trade. Like everything to them it's like no different than buying a stock, I think. There's a life cycle in their mind to this. Like there's a half-life to it, right?
Yeah, but I mean, value investing is dead. So their idea of even stock picks is not the same. It's not Warren Buffett grabbing something 70 years ago and holding on to it the entire time. There is a kind of a bit of a hype in and out, even in the stock market, right?
Yeah.
Like, let alone the crypto market. But
Yeah.
Just to put a cap on that previous point, I guess what I was trying to say is, like, you come to Bitcoin with some kind of humble likeness, and then I think you get a very different side of people.
True.
And yeah, I 100% agree. It's like, you really have to learn, like, the history of money to understand money, and then you kind of have to understand Bitcoin to understand where we are, like, as monetary technology, right?
So a lot of my friends will say, why do I have to own this Bitcoin asset? Can I just buy gold? We call it digital gold, right? So can I just buy gold, they'll say, and preserve my wealth there? I'm not trying to be speculative. And what is your answer to somebody who says that?
I think it's a fascinating question. There's so much nuance here that, yes, I think if you buy gold in general, it's like ceteris paribus. If you ignore everything else, if you're just to hold gold versus holding the dollar, they make more dollars every year. They don't make as many more gold every year. They do make more gold, though. They make about 1.8% of the supply of gold every year, which is about, if you think about 2% inflation, it's about 2% of the gold. So, that kind of makes sense. But there's a few things. One is that the gold market's completely cornered by central banks. And when gold trades, it trades like 90% of its trade is like paper, right? It's paper gold.
Yeah.
And if you have monopolies over who owns the gold, and the gold itself never moves, and nobody's auditing this stuff, it's like a monetary device, right? It doesn't really work very well. Gold used to be money because we would actually spend coins, or we would redeem paper for it, and no longer is that the case. You can't spend gold. You can't. I mean, not only is it like, in order to spend a small transaction, you'd need, like, a little microgram worth of gold. It's just unruly to do. 90% of all of our transactions in the world are online. So you're just like, thing's connected to the gold anymore. So, and that's really exactly what happened leading up to 1971 when we went off the gold standard, is that there was more paper in existence than there was gold. Anytime you saw this exchange kind of break down, there would always end up being like, oh, well, we just print a few more pieces of paper. Who cares, And then when people come and try to get their gold, 1929, when people come and try to get their gold in 1971, the thing breaks down. You need to have money that is transacted on the base layer, that's exchanged for things, and that's a little bit harder, I think, for folks to understand.
Speaking of the base layer, there's the second layer. There's Lightning. Other than Lightning, what is the one trend in Bitcoin that excites you?
Oh, in Bitcoin, man. I actually think custody is one of the things that's like, we're so early on custody, like being able to hold like large amounts of Bitcoin securely in a robust way that's easy to use. It also, like, on the side of like us having custodians that help us do this for us. Companies like MicroStrategy, man, these guys hold a lot of Bitcoin, and they basically just hold it with this company that just does it for them, and they're just like, oh yeah, you guys got that, right? Regardless, they kind of trust them. I understand it's probably not the end of the world there, but it could be, right? That custodian could get hacked, and with multi-sig and all these other things. Yeah, well, it's a honeypot, right? Because it's such a large, that's what exchanges are. Is they're these very, very large honeypots, and we kind of need to decentralize the holding of Bitcoin the same way we need to, all the centralization of the holding of gold is a problem. You don't want the same thing to happen with Bitcoin, and it's much easier to move. We're still kind of developing the tools to do that. So that's why I think we're on the kind of cutting edge of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think wallets there's got to be a lot more investment that goes into wallets, and I just think like the UI of the purchasing and the whole transactional experience, I think it's just different. And most people don't even own stocks. They don't know how to use brokerage accounts to begin with. And if you log into like Gemini and to Coinbase, it's not exactly like a regular brokerage account. Similar, but it's not quite the same. So there's some, just the idea of the address thing, right? Like, and then like the fear too, right? Like if you go to click to copy because your long alphanumeric character addresses, you could have a virus that's a copy paste virus, right? And people aren't even aware of those kind of issues potentially. So stuff like that has to get fixed, I guess, right?
Yeah, it's an evolution rather than flipping a switch.
Yeah. Just like the internet was.
Right, and then that's why I think the technologies that are being developed today in the next 5 years are the things that will kind of quote unquote solve those problems. But it's interesting to watch because because Bitcoin is this like infinitely extensible thing. In a way that it's digital information, it can evolve in ways that we can't even imagine today, and that's what I find fascinating. So,
I put a tweet out today. Other than Bitcoin, tell me one truth that you know that other people disagree with you on, or have disagreed with you on.
Other than Bitcoin.
Other than Bitcoin, tell me a truth that you knew. This is a Peter Thiel quote, right? I'm just kind of mincing it, right? So, other than Bitcoin as a truth, what is the one truth that you've had that other people disagreed with you on?
I feel like I'm an outlier on the energy / climate change thing. Hear me out. I think there's nuance to this discussion. I think the Bitcoin community and a lot of libertarians and such, they're like, oh, that the push for the new Green New Deal and all these things, it's essentially communism, and it's all these problems, and that that if you look at what do you call it, really geological scale, like temperatures, that there hasn't really that it goes through all these different cycles, and that the humans can't affect all that. That's totally fine. I think that pollution itself isn't actually separate from all of that. Like, we're emitting particulate matter into the atmosphere. Right. Go to LA, go to China. Right. Like, there's smog and haze and and degraded air quality. Yeah. So it's not that fossil fuels are this perfectly awesome thing. Yes, they're amazing technology that we kind of still need to keep using. Solar energy in the future may be a big part of, I don't know what the mix is. What I do agree with is that, we shouldn't have the government come along and fix all these things. But I'm just saying that I think there is some kind of nuance. And in our community, as you know, if you'd said anything like that, you'll probably get stoned to death. So that's something that I have a degree in geography, so I kind of know a little bit about this stuff. I'm not just talking.
Where do you shake out on the vaccines and COVID and all that kind of stuff? Speaking of our community.
I support liberty, so I support choice. I think people should be able to make their own decisions for themselves and protect themselves however they feel necessary. So I definitely don't support any kind of mandates whatsoever.
So you're on a subway in New York City. You don't think that people have to wear the masks, or you don't care about that. So if you're not comfortable with that, you should stay home. But the ones that are doing those things, they can do whatever they want. You're saying that's where you stand in it.
Yeah, and I'm a libertarian, so I kind of would view a world where the subway would be a private organization, and they would regulate what you could do on the subway itself, and that would either make or break their business.
Yeah, because it's not considered. It wouldn't be a government enforcing it at that point, right?
Yeah. So it gets more and more nuanced the deeper you go.
All right, let's talk about inflation, right? We're having a real problem here. Supply chain is breaking down or has broken down. I read an article that I reposted that I think Preston put out a few weeks ago, and it was a truck driver. So he had a CDL license, and he was saying that usually it takes about an hour to get through these checkpoints within the ports, right, to go pick up a new container, and it's up to 8 to 9 hours, and these guys get paid by the job, not by the hour, unless you work for a union like the Teamster, right? So they're losing money, right? Because they get paid by the job. So some of them just quit. They're like, screw it, I ain't doing this anymore, because they're just independent contractors. It's like a smart side business for them. They're like, this isn't even worth it. I'll go do something else. And plus they're getting stimulus checks and everything else, which further backs things up. It kind of explodes the problem even more for us. Okay. There's all these ships out on the water and the shores waiting. We ran out of chassis for the chains. This could potentially take years to clear up. I don't think inflation is going anywhere anytime soon. How do you think they fix this? And it sounds like the Fed's now talking about raising the rates because that's not going to change anything as it relates to the supply chain. What do you think of all this stuff?
Yeah, it's such a complex, multivariate problem, Jay. I mean, you highlighted some of the big issues there, but what's really interesting too is that because of the inflation itself, so if you just as a quick money itself is the organizer of human action. Through the price system, we all bid with our time. What job you decide to take or not, what thing you decide to buy, that price has a huge influence on that. It's not the only factor that you consider, but it's one of the biggest factors that you always consider on which actions you're going to take. And when you increase the money supply or you change the money supply, inflation itself is distorting that price system. That of all of us, billions of people bidding with our time and deciding which thing we want to get. So when you interrupt those prices by changing the money supply, you're distorting the organization of humans. There's that amazing talk by Milton Friedman, it's called I Pencil, where he talks about like nobody knows how to make a pencil because a pencil is made by thousands and thousands of people across the world, where the wood comes from, the metal, the rubber, the graphite. And these aren't, there's no central body that tells each one of these people what thing to make and how much of it. It's the price system that tells them what to make. And it's just assembled in some factory, right? But like no one person knows how to get that rubber and the metal refining and create the paint and all these. No one person in the entire world knows how to do that. It's the price system that organizes that action. And when you disrupt the prices through all these things, you disrupt our collaboration as a global society. So that's going to be another wrench in the gears on top of all of the other things that you said. And, how are they, quote unquote, going to fix it? I think we Austrian economists have been saying since the start of this, since March 20, when they started printing trillions of dollars, that this is going to have effects. And they're going to, I don't know how these things get repaired. I think it takes a really long time. And they have to stop printing money to do it. And then you have to wait for things to slosh back this way and kind of, eventually settle back into, reality, because that's where we're living it's in a fake reality that we've created within inflation that kind of puts us all we're buying the wrong thing. We're looking in the wrong place because of all the distorted price signals.
Well, the Fed's saying that they're going to possibly raise the rates. You've heard me on Clubhouse all year saying I think the Fed's going to raise rates. Tina starts yelling and screaming at me. It's not going to happen. We'll go into Great Depression. I'm like, I disagree. They do things that you don't think they'll do. They've done that for decades, and I think they will again. And here they are now at the end of the year saying what I said in January. They're now saying it verbally for the last quarter, right? That they're going to, the tapering has started, right? And then the next step will be more tapering, and then the next step will be the rates going up. What do you think happens when they do that? Do you think the market just crash on them and tail wagging the dog kind of thing, or what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I'm like you, where I'm not in the habit of predicting human action, especially not the people at the Federal Reserve, because that's, it's reading the tea leaves or reading Janet Yellen's, Blazer or whatever. But what happens if they raise rates is very simple. When rates are low, people can borrow money, and it's expansionary. You're increasing the money supply because they can borrow more. They're incentivized to borrow more. You're changing the prices of borrowing money itself. So people are going to do something that's the non-reality world that we live in. And when you cut that off, you kind of stop the money printer, and people realize that, oh, well, I don't have enough money to pay back this thing I borrowed, so I got to sell this thing to pay that back, right? Because I was living in a fantasy, and now we're coming back closer to reality. And these endeavors that I maybe started, this business that I started that was profitable under inflation, is no longer profitable. I have to close this business, and that hurts that guy, and he loses his job, and it's very cascading in that way. So what will happen is that essentially people have to sell off some of their assets, the assets that they've been hoarding as money, right? These assets have acquired some monetary value, and it kind of, people come back into dollars, and that's deflationary. It hurts asset prices, and then it hurts the wealth effect. So the economy kind of, quote unquote, slows down as we kind of have to, I call it like a hangover, right? That when you're, inflation is like a drug. It's like drinking. And when we keep printing money the next day, when we keep kicking the can down the road, in 2008, we printed a bunch of dollars. We're like waking up and drinking more the next day. What we, raising the rates is what we need, but it's not what we want. It's stopping drinking and having the headache and having the hangover so that you can eventually feel better, and actually heal yourself, rather than just feeling better by being drunk in the short term. So that's what happens. That the prices go down, and it's just bad for the economy. People stop borrowing money, and things kind of, quote, grind a halt. It's like 2008, somewhat like 2008 is like a really intense event to that, but it's like a mini 2008. The tapering is like, oh, maybe if we just do a little bit, Yeah, and then it can cause those cascades as well. So,
and that's the question that where I'm at, Ben. I'm like, does it cause the cascade? Because kind of where I shake out on this is
you can't predict that.
Clearly can't predict anything, but they have to try something, right? Because if we keep doing what we're doing, we know that this parabolic move just continues to rise, and we get completely. If we think we're disconnected from reality now, 5 more years of this, where are we at? I mean, this PE ratios are going to be like 100, for the S&P. It's going to be off the charts. So I think what is a possibility, don't know, is that they slowly increase the rates over an extended period of time, maybe way slower than ever have before. And it starts to unwind the debt in a way where if you unwind it too fast, it would be rapid unwinding, right? If you go and this is where it's a slight nuance, and it's really difficult because if they screw this up, they'll have to print money like endlessly to fix it once again, and that'll make the problem even worse. But if they do it in a very slow, predictable manner that the markets are comfortable with, there's going to be defined losers in that playbook, right? We know that because you can look at the balance sheets across the S&P 500 and say, if you raise the rate by a quarter point, these 10 companies will fail in the next 6 months to a year or whatever. But if you go 50 basis points, there's going to be more. And then there's an ancillary effect that happens to all the companies that are interconnected to them. So if they do it at such a slow rate, and I can't imagine that the Fed doesn't have like a master spreadsheet of all the public companies and understanding their balance sheets, their cash flows, all this. They know exactly what's going to happen if they raise rates. They're very keenly aware of that, I would imagine. If not, they're just playing it by ear. Like, it's kind of crazy. So they have to know that like there will be casualties to this war. They've been trying to not have that since 2018 in December. And I don't think you can do that forever. I think you have to kind of make a move and see what happens and slow. And you got to get the markets comfortable with it so they don't just, oh my God, what's the Fed doing? And start selling off. They have to be like, okay, we know what they're doing. And unfortunately, we'll just have to sell off these companies because they're fucking ghosts. They're dead, right? And then the ones that are connected to them that have issues, that's the ecosystem, right? Shipping companies, all their supply chain, right? Like there's going to be an issue there. I don't know. I disagree with my Bitcoin friends on that they can never raise rates again. I don't agree with that. I think they can do it very, very, very carefully and slowly because at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, we know what their playbook is to fix it.
Well, yes, we know what the playbook is, and that can make things worse on the other side. But there aren't many things that we can know for sure, except there are some things that we can know for sure, that the liquidation of malinvestment has to come. There is malinvestment. It's that, like I was just saying, these endeavors that we've taken on under an inflationary environment that made sense on paper because of the inflation aren't actually profitable endeavors. The zombie companies that we have today that only survive on debt, they have to be liquidated at some point, right? I don't know when that comes. This idea of kicking the can forever, you can kind of do that actually, but it has other effects. I always talk
just
about,
hurts the people.
Yes, exactly. It's like whack-a-mole. You're pushing down this thing and something pops up somewhere else that, you can prevent maybe markets from crashing, but you increase that wealth stratification that we were talking about earlier because of the inflation. So now the inflation's the problem, and they're trying to taper that without the cascade of liquidations that I was talking about. So they're trying to find a sweet spot. They're not necessarily trying to unwind. You said the word unwind the debt. They're not trying to like get back to zero, right?
No. You got to deflating the bubble a little.
It's more stop adding air that they're trying to do. They're constantly adding air, and then they're worried about the bubble bursting. So they're trying to slow down how much they're adding it and get to a stable thing. They're not trying to deflate it because that would cause cascades.
Well, interestingly though, you said like these companies are zombies. We know the zombie companies, right? But look at the GameStop situation, right? Like that was amazing because then they went out and raised debt, and they're not going anywhere now, right? So like that's interesting. Like it becomes this like meme stock, and the ability for them to then create shares and sell to the public and get some more cash on the balance sheet and extend the life cycle. Maybe they could try to figure a pivot in some way, acquire something. Who knows? That's amazing. I would not have guessed something like that happening.
But it's a sign of the times, Jay, that I said earlier, like value investing is dead because we live in this non-reality, this virtual reality of prices where like kind of nothing really matters fundamentally speaking, and it's all like a hype game. Like is Tesla worth the money that the PE ratio that they are right now? No, obviously. So like we're pushed as a society out into risk, and that whole AMC and GameStop thing is just it's just people gambling, right? Like that's all it was. And now there's like, because of that whole fun thing, that's like, now there's like an affinity for it, and people are like, no, we're gonna save this thing, and like, I don't know if it'll actually, last, but for now, the society has decided that's what they're gonna put their money into, because F it, why not, right?
So I had VJ on yesterday. I recorded with him yesterday, yes. And he's awesome, right? We talked about that. He's amazing. Book is amazing. The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. There. Everybody should read that. I think, particularly if you're new to Bitcoin, I think you should read it because it teaches about the history of money, to your point, right? So in the book, though, he also talks about the potential risks to Bitcoin. And he has a list of them. The only one that I've been saying the whole time is the Federal Reserve. And he had it in there. And I was like, this guy's really on point with everything. So that's the only real risk. And actually, talking to him, he said he believes that's really the only real risk. Anything. These other risks, they're out there. They're like, they're greater than a 0% probability, but very much probably almost zero. But I think the Federal Reserve is the risk, right? And I don't think it's under this administration. It's certainly not under, with Biden, I'm saying, and also certainly not under Jay Powell. It's just maybe somebody else gets in there and does something unpredictable. So far, I think he's pretty predictable. I think we're comfortable with what he's doing. I don't know that we love what they're doing, but I don't know if there's an alternative to anything they're doing, right? What happens if somebody gets in there and just decides to be a Paul Volcker one day? I mean, could you imagine? And what would happen if they increase the interest rates dramatically as a response to Bitcoin, to try to kill Bitcoin, to try to crush Bitcoin, to try to take back control of money if they're losing control to Bitcoin? Do you think that's a real possibility at some point where they just say, we have no alternative, or we're going into a... And the only way that this happens, according to V, because he says that there's a risk for this too, and he's like, it's low probability, but the risk is there. He doesn't see it happening anytime soon, particularly at a $1 trillion asset, right? But we get closer to gold parity, and we don't have a lot of adoption across politicians. You need to get adoption, which is why I love what CJ Wilson and those folks are doing with the lobbyist group, because you really want to orange pill the politicians, right? Because if they can understand that there's a growing constituency of voters that care about this, that vote their dollars on this, particularly folks like us, the libertarians of the world that are single issue voters, right, for the most part. Because we're not going to get fallen into the wedge politics, I think, right? But that to me is probably the greatest risk in the short term to Bitcoin's growth. I don't think it ever even kills Bitcoin, even if it does that. It would just crush the price in the short term and lose a lot of faith in the short term. And it could take a while to recover from that. What do you think of that?
It would in the short term, but it would also crush the rest of the asset market.
Yes.
We are finally seeing Bitcoin become correlated. In 2019, when we were pitching this to people, we were like, this is an uncorrelated asset, bro. Add this to your portfolio. It's not anymore. And I actually think that's a good thing. It's becoming, it's becoming kind of institutionalized. It's becoming a normal part of our society. It's a normal asset to own. You were a weirdo for having it in 2017. Now it's kind of normal to have in your portfolio. So that's fine. What they would do is they would also crush all those other asset prices. But Bitcoin isn't a better money because they stop printing. It's not only a better money because they print money. It's not only a better money because of inflation. It's a better money because you can never print Bitcoin, right? Mm-hmm. There's assurances about Bitcoin that you'll never have. It's like, oh, well, what if we just went back to a gold standard, bro? Wouldn't that kill Bitcoin? It's like, no, because like another Nixon could always be looming around the corner. The same way that you're saying a Paul Volcker could be looming around the corner. There is no assurances in the future about the future supply of USD.
Don't you think that the adoption of Bitcoin more recently is because of the narrative around, which wasn't, to your point earlier, like I remember this when I first was introduced to Bitcoin many years ago. I was probably 2012 or 13 as well. And it was not on Slashdot. It was actually on LVC.com, which was Fred Wilson's blog. So that's when I first started reading it. So whatever his first post was, that's the first time I read it, because I used to read his stuff religiously. So that was my first introduction to it. And then I did a little research and Googled around, talked to my friends. But it was considered a cryptocurrency. It was not considered a store of value. That was not the narrative. I understand Satoshi and others were talking about that on the message board. That's not what people were talking about, though, right? Like, it may have been like some high level stuff that was talked about in passing, but that was not the narrative that was being pushed. That is the narrative that's being pushed today. And it's a great narrative for adoption. It's also the truth, right? That it is sort of like a hedge. And I think Chamath was one of the earliest ones that I recall on CNBC talking about it as schmuck insurance, right?
Yeah.
But it's true, like, but in a world in which they did something like that, that narrative just disappears, right? To your point, it kills all the assets though. So I don't know that they could actually do that. It would have to, it's a political suicide to do something like that.
Well, I always like to say that Bitcoin's becoming money, and I actually drew a lot of my understanding from monetary economics from Vijay Boyapati, who you're talking about his book, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, and he always talked about money. It's an emergent phenomenon in society that when you take money out of a society, we reinvent it, right? Like in a prison, you take money out, when prisoners reinvent it with cigarettes or sardines, whatever they use. It's something that emerges when there's scarce economic goods that we created. It's a tool, and as something becomes a money, it starts as a store of value, then it becomes a medium of exchange, and only like finally becomes a unit of account. So like Bitcoin's on this journey to do that. So it's hard for people because they're like, oh well, but nobody, you can't buy things for Bitcoin or whatever. And it's like, well, it's like not money yet. It's weird.
I didn't ask Vijay yesterday. I will. He's going to come back on my show because we didn't really talk about his story. I want to talk about his story, but I really wanted to talk about Vijay's book. It was like, yeah. But the next thing I told him, is like, you got to come back on. He goes, absolutely, But anyway, I guess, at the end of the day, what I wanted to ask him, what I ask a lot of people on the show is, are you all in on Bitcoin? And so I ask you, Ben, are you all in? Do you own any stocks? Do you have any other assets? Do you have real estate? Anything?
Nope. And I quit my job and started a Bitcoin job. I changed careers, everything. My entire life is Bitcoin. Even when I hang out with my friends, I usually try to shoehorn it into a conversation if it's appropriate. But like I think it's the most important technology in the world by far. The most important technology is coming along since the internet, and I think it will continue to be the most important. And I want to be a part of it as much as I can and try to help Bitcoin become money.
From a perspective of the folks in your life, your family and friends, right? The real people, not these internet people we know, right? But the people you actually physically know. How many of them have you been successfully able to orange pill?
The closest ones to me, most of them.
Okay.
My parents.
Ben, are they orange pill or do they own it?
Not all of them.
They just own it, but they don't fully understand it?
Some of my best friends are orange pilled and some of them aren't, but a lot of them have some. And my parents are actually the interesting ones. They're the most orange pilled out of everybody.
Man.
Yeah. But my dad was, like I said, was a software engineer. So like he took like 6 months of me listening, me talking about it. And he, remember I was saying like about asking the question of why, like he would ask questions and he would never be like, he would be kind of critical the same way like you would kind of come, but like, more like, but he always had questions. He's like, okay, well, right, but what is this? And like,
I remember you getting frustrated with some of my questions. Actually, you're like, no, Jay, the reason. And I'm like, sorry, bro. I'm not trying to be an antagonist.
Yeah, but is
that what your dad did?
No, I mean, yeah, that kind of thing. But like, one day he read the Bitcoin Standard and he was like texting me, like he was on a plane texting me like, oh my God, bro, like why do we use fiat money still? And like he completely fell down the rabbit hole. It just took a while. It took a while,
So he actually had like an aha moment at some point. He remembers like, you remember
yes.
a pivotal point. Yeah. It's funny. I don't remember having like a moment, It was just a culmination of things over years and rapidly over the last year getting much more convicted on it than I was previously. But I guess I viewed it as a trade for a while, like any other position you would have in a position of a company or something. And it's like, that's not what this is. It's totally not what it is at all. Yeah.
I remember getting frustrated with you, and I think it was because I didn't understand what your whole thing was like. And I think I later found out by talking to you more is that like, you really just want to understand what this thing that you've been holding for a while. You've probably been holding it longer than I had. Like, what is this? I need to understand this thing. And I'm going to ask every question I have to.
Yeah, too much money in it. Especially when it went up a lot. I was like, Jesus Christ, should I sell this or what?
You're like, well, Ben, why'd it go down now? And I'm like, listen, Jay, I don't know everything.
So funny. Let me ask you two more questions. I think I know the answer to this one, but outside of Vijay's book, what is your favorite book on Bitcoin? If it's not that book, what is the another book if it is?
I mean, the Bitcoin Standard is awesome, mostly because of the history of money that it goes through. So I'll throw one that maybe folks haven't heard that's similar, that's way more nerdy, because I'm really into monetary economics and the history of money. is Shelling Out by Nick Szabo, who is one of the guys that was very early on in the cypherpunks and kind of the history of digital money. Shelling Out by Nick Szabo is like the real history of money, and it's completely in depth. It doesn't talk about Bitcoin at all, but it shows you how it's that emergent thing in society that you can't get rid of, and that it kind of evolved over hundreds and thousands of years, and you really understand what money is after learning that story. I think in ways that's hard to. There's no substitute for understanding that. Like, you can't, like, I can't explain it to you in a sentence. You have to kind of like understand it for real by going.
Saifedean's book is a difficult book, I think. I don't recommend it to people. And I say that, and I'm glad we're like an hour plus in, because most people won't get this far. I'm not trying to say not to read it. You should read the book, the Bitcoin Standard. It's a good book, but it's a difficult book if it's the first book you're reading on Bitcoin. I don't recommend that. I think VJ is good for that. Once you get through his book, I think you'll get the other one a little bit easier, because I think it'll introduce you to things that you'll probably start reaching on your own. You start Googling shit. You know what I mean?
Also, Jason Williams' book is
that's a great book
to start on as well.
Awesome.
And, humble brag, as you let me know, I'm actually in the book. I was cited in the book.
I told you. You didn't know.
It is a good book. It was, yeah.
He had a whole chapter with your name in it. It was not your name, but like the WTF happened in 1971. He talks about it, and I was like, "Did you know you're on the book?" You're like, "I had no idea."
I was like, what? And I went and bought the book. Just
I go,
to find
he's on
out.
stage with us every day. He's never told you this.
No.
That's so.
He's
funny.
a weird guy, Jason. Oh,
yeah, he's a little off.
That's a good book.
What's your favorite quote?
My favorite quote. Oof. This probably would be Einstein. I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. And I think that drives me to be like, man, I'm not as smart as some of those other people, but I'm really curious, and I really want to learn as much about this thing as I can. And that passion, curiosity is what led me to Bitcoin. So for sure.
Ben, are you going to be at 2022 Bitcoin in Miami?
I think so, because I tried to say last year I wasn't going to go, and then Peter basically was like, "Oh, well, I'll buy you a ticket or something," and I was like, fine. And then they let me speak or whatever. So I will probably end up being there. I haven't figured out the plans yet.
Okay, yeah. And so, what are you doing these days other than being on Clubhouse? What are you up to right now? And then the producing. Is that what you're doing for the most part?
Yes, I've been spending. Like I said, I just learned how to do video editing and audio producing. So like I've kind of changed careers again within my new job, and it's been a lot of work. I'm doing like 4K video and 5 camera shoots and like lighting and all this, color correction. So I'm like, I worked like 60 hours last week, so that's like all I'm doing right now. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. And
is he starting? Is Peter doing them? I saw him do some in person. Is he going to go back to in person now? Or is he doing them?
We're doing like 90% in person with cameramen on site. Like,
do you fly into those shows and stuff? Like, how does that all work? Or do you stay remote?
I don't.
Okay.
No. I've only been to 1 or 2 recordings. So I do everything from.
He sets his own lights up and all that stuff.
No, he's a cameraman. So like sometimes we hire somebody, but like we have like a guy in the US who's like kind of been flying around.
And he flies around and meets him there and stuff. And you pay for that. Like, God, he must be making a lot of money on a show to be able to pay for all this. It's pretty impressive. Yeah.
It's amazing how much money gets thrown around, but like, I mean,
he's got a lot of sponsors though. Like I have no sponsors on my show. I just do the show, but like he's made a business out of it, obviously, and I just do it for fun.
He's hustled for sure. It's impressive. Yeah. And he's put his company on the Bitcoin Standard and holds like most of the balance sheet in Bitcoin.
Oh,
so
wow.
yeah. And actually the second time I was on the show, it was WTF happened in 2020. So it was after like they started printing all this money. It was after Michael Saylor started like buying all this Bitcoin, and he asked us, he was like, "Well, what do you think that makes Saylor?" And I was like, "Well, I think Saylor will be the capital allocator of the future." And he goes, "Shit, I need to buy some more Bitcoin." So like I was part of him like moving his company onto the Bitcoin Standard by like laying out these arguments for why. Yeah.
When you say he's going to be the capital allocator, are you saying that he'll be one of the best capital allocators? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I'm saying that he owns so much Bitcoin that if Bitcoin monetizes in the future, he will have so much more wealth that he'll be able to allocate capital in the future. Yeah. He's not even running MicroStrategy anymore. He's running like
it's an ETF for
like
Bitcoin.
A bid on it's a bid on the future. But that's what I'm saying. He's amassing. He doesn't need any more money. You've heard him say that. He's like, I don't need no more jets or more yachts or anything. He wants to make the world a better place. He wants to allocate capital in the future, and that's what he's setting himself up to do.
It's kind of what Hodl's talk was last year, right? Yeah. Similar idea. Let me ask you this. We're about to hop in a second, but if you can go back 10 years ago and give yourself some advice, what would that be?
Other than buy Bitcoin, of course.
Of course.
I think like I was saving money, and I should have been investing, and I should have really. So it's hard to it's hard to answer that without saying, buy Bitcoin and learn about how to invest your money. But I think the other thing I would say is along the way, probably in a different way, your family and your friends and the time that you have is the most scarce thing on this planet, and to really value those things and respect them, I think is it's amazing, because you can't get that time back, and it's hard to go back sometimes when friends drift away and repair. It's hard to get those things back sometimes. So I value my people and my time and my health and my family a lot more than dollars and Bitcoin. So I think that would be good advice, is to kind of reinforce that.
So there's so many people coming into Bitcoin. If you think about it, there's 100 million plus people that have Bitcoin. Nobody really knows, but 200 million, something like that. There's 7 billion people on the planet. It really does remind me of a parallel to internet adoption, right? So in the late 1990s, there was around the same number of people, 50 to 100 million people. Today, it's like 4.5 billion people out of the 7 billion people. Cell phone adoption is off the charts when you think about that too. I think it's something like 7.1 billion people have a cell phone out of the 7.7 or 7.8 billion people on the planet. It's almost everybody has a cell phone now. Elon's putting up satellites and stuff that'll be beaming the internet down. I think Facebook's kind of working on that project as well through them, I think. So the adoption is there. It's going to increasingly be there. There's going to be people that see this show and other shows. What would you say to those people that are curious about Bitcoin but aren't quite there? How do they get there quickly?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you talk about that adoption curve, Jay, because for me, the more and more I think about Bitcoin being adopted globally, how it could happen, I feel like it will be a very gradual process for a very long time, and then one day it won't be gradual anymore.
Yeah.
I don't think that the way that people adopt a digital money, like a revolutionary digital money that's a paradigm-shifting technology that'll change the world forever, they don't adopt that the same way that they adopt the internet, which was also a paradigm-shifting technology that changed the world forever. Because you kind of have the same way that you have to kind of build communications technologies and all these other things to make telephones work, or you have to build the Bitcoin has to make sense from liquidity, and there has to be tools and stuff like that to make it work. And so if until those pieces are in place, it can't become money, and then gradually that stuff happens, and one day suddenly I think people realize that they need Bitcoin, and not being in it at that time would mean you'd kind of miss out on some really interesting monetization gains. But to simply answer your question, the easiest way to get started with Bitcoin is to buy $10, buy $50 worth, because that's what I did. I was trying to learn about it, and then I remember buying my first $50 and I was invested in it, and I was like, well, now I have this thing, I want to learn more, what can I do with it, and I needed to know more. Even if it's only $50, pretend it's gambling, right? Pretending you're spending $50 on a lottery ticket or whatever, or entertainment, or instead of going out for lunch one day, $50, start somewhere. That is the only way you can start, because you can't care about it until you are actually a holder, I think.
I agree. And I think Hodl says something that really hit home to me. He said, because I always equate to network externality, and I had businesses that were internet companies that were the beneficiaries of network effects, right? And I would talk about this on stage, and I would say it's very similar to this. And then he would talk to me offline and be like, you're right, there's a network effect. But the difference is that Bitcoin is a monetary network, and those are social networks. So the nodes in a social network are the human beings. We know that there's 7-point-some billion people in the world. 4.7 billion are on the internet today. So total addressable market is 4.7 billion. He's like, but this is a monetary network. So there's $400 trillion in assets and dollar values globally, and maybe half of that is a store of value. This is a Michael Saylor kind of argument, which, by the way, is a Hal Finney argument, I think, or maybe Satoshi himself. I can't remember. This might be Hal Finney.
Hal Finney.
Yeah, it was in. I think it was in VJ's book, actually. But yeah, it's like, so what is the addressable market? It's 200 full $1 bills, 200 trillion of them, right? We have 1 out of the 200 trillion right now, right? So 1 trillion out of 200 trillion. We are super early, dude. Like, it's incredible. It's almost worrisome how early we are, right? Like, it's like the internet in 1985, actually, when it was prodigy. I don't even think it's like 1995, because of the size.
But as somebody who adopted the internet in 1980, like, yeah, you did gain something, but you didn't gain anything from other people adopting it at the time.
Yeah.
You could start later and kind of like gain most, like you could miss out on the adoption itself of Bitcoin. And that is very different,
That's right. And so what I'm saying is that the dollars are coming in. It could happen very rapidly, unlike a natural organic growth of usage adoption of things, right? With users that are considered the nodes, the dollars can come in. If Carl Icahn decides, I want to put 10% of my net worth in, that's $2 billion. Poof, number goes up a little bit more, right? A little bit more. It's not going to go parabolic, but it'll go a little bit more. And then you get another billionaire decides to come in. Let's just say it's Warren Buffett. It's not going to happen, but let's just say he does it. We're going to put in $5 billion, pushes it up, right? But then you get into this like FOMO of the billionaire saying, I don't want to miss on this thing. So then that money starts, and then everybody else is sitting on the sidelines going, it's got to crash, right? That's the risk. I think the risk is not being in at all. To your point, I think if someone's sitting there watching this or any other show and they're just been on the fence about it, you gotta get your toes in the water, because when you see the growth, when you own it, it's what happened to me. When you see it and you see it like running away, even though you have exposure to it, your regret is I didn't put more in. So then you start adding more dollars as it goes up. They're larger chunks each time it goes up. They're larger investments of your dollars. And you're so pissed because you're like, why am I putting these large dollars in now when I could have did it earlier, right? But this is what you have to do, and it's like they say, it's the price you'll pay is what you deserve. But anyway, I want to hop on this. We've been on for almost an hour and a half or so. I really enjoyed speaking with you on Clubhouse all the time. Met you there. Consider you a good friend now, and so Ben, good to see you again. First time I actually got to talk to you. Like we never did a Zoom call or anything, so this is the first time. Yeah. So where can people find you? They just go on Twitter?
Yeah, just Twitter. I was on the Bitcoin Echo Chamber podcast a bunch of times back in the day. We don't really release a whole lot of episodes these days, but Twitter's the way to find me, and I'm always happy to have a chat, for any reason. So at Mr. Cool BP, MRCOOLBP.
I'll put it in the description below. And once again, Ben, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Jay.